Thank you so much for being here. Now I'm going to introduce Reverend Ken Garrett. His talk today is called Church Isn't Supposed to Hurt: 7 Sins of Christian Churches That Manipulate and Abuse Members. Ken is a senior pastor of Grace Church located in his hometown of Portland, Oregon. And he has also established the Spiritual Abuse Forum for Education, otherwise known as SAFE Meetups. It's a monthly gathering to promote friendship and education for survivors of spiritual abuse. Ken just released his book, In the House of Friends: Understanding and Healing from Spiritual Abuse in the Christian Church. At this time, I'm very excited to let Ken present. Thank you so much for being here.
Hello, my name's Ken Garrett. I live in Portland, Oregon, and welcome to my patio for the next couple of minutes. I just wanted to meet with you. It's morning time for me right now, and I feel that I do my best. I'm at my best talking about spiritual abuse in Christian churches and whatnot over a cup of coffee, sitting across the table from somebody, and even abuse experienced in other religious groups and whatnot. So I've got my coffee, and I sure wish we were sitting across a table in Montreal or in a hotel lobby or something, but here we are, as much of this year has been kind of weird for meetings and meetups and whatnot. So this is it, and I look forward to seeing people with the International Cultic Studies Association, wonderful people, and I look forward to those meetings when they occur again. But I'm here today ready to teach and talk about spiritual abuse as it occurs in Christian churches. And it is because I myself am a survivor of spiritual abuse in a Christian church, really rotten abuse. And it's called spiritual abuse, but let's never get away from the fact that it's spiritual abuse that often, if not always, takes place in the realm of money, sexual abuse, physical abuse, loss, family separation, horrible stress on marriages. I mean, the title might be a spiritual title, but the effects are pretty hard and pretty material and real. So we're going to talk about that in terms of spiritual abuse as it occurs in Christian churches. And it's not just limited to Christian churches. So if you're here with us right now with me and you are not in a Christian church, or perhaps you were hurt in a Christian church and you're just not in a place of wanting anything to do with Christian anything, I get it. And this isn't an attempt to change your thinking about that or anything. Or perhaps you were hurt in another kind of place or a cult or something. This will still be not just as beneficial, not just a little beneficial, but it'll be just as beneficial to hear about the mechanisms of abuse that occurs and what it looks like inside one of these groups. So I thank you for being here, for all of you who were hurt in any kind of a system or group or gathering or place where your spiritual beliefs, the deepest thoughts and beliefs and faith of your soul were used against you and you were hurt and abused. And I just count it quite an honor that you would be here, and I thank you for that. And if you're joining us out of a desire to just get perhaps some more information, maybe you're an educator or a therapist who's wondering what is the deal with these people coming out of these places, I hope I can fill in that a little bit more for you. So I'm going to go inside now and make an official video and all that, but I just wanted to meet with you. I wish we were in Montreal. I think I said that, having a real cup of coffee together, but we're not, so we'll see about maybe in a couple of years. Until then, again, thank you very much for being here, and I look forward to the next hour we have together. Well, hello. Church isn't supposed to hurt. Again, I'm Ken Garrett. I'm a pastor. And I have done a bit of writing about spiritual abuse, and most importantly, I am the survivor of a spiritually abusive church. I was a member of this church from 1984 until 1996. Started my family while we were in this church. My wife and I were together before the church, and we joined it in 84, left it in 96, and it was an excruciating church. It became an excruciating church to be a member of, and let alone to leave. So churches can hurt people, and that's why I titled this "Church Isn't Supposed to Hurt." Um, it's supposed to be a positive experience to be in a church, as becoming a Christian is supposed to be a positive experience. So just to kind of set the stage a little bit, what is a church? A church, as I think most of us know, it comes from an ancient word, ecclesia, which means to be called out. And this comes from the old days of the Greek democracies, where the voting men, the men of a village, to conduct business, they would be selected and called out of their affairs of the day to determine some sort of business, and a business of the village. So it's interesting that one of the first descriptions of the church is that it is an ecclesia. It is a called out people. And we would say, just for our own sake of definition here, that a church is a local community of people who share faith in Jesus Christ, they have voluntarily joined together to encourage one another through authentic, caring friendship, worship, and prayer, and have a common goal of inviting neighbors and friends and family to themselves place their faith in Jesus Christ for salvation and join the church. I know that that sounds a little straight on, and I don't use my assistance with cultic survivors or church survivors to recruit them into a church or even the Christian faith. But I feel it's really important that as the process of extending our faith and inviting others to share it and hoping for opportunities to talk about it, that is a part of the Christian faith. And I think as Christians, we need to be just upfront with that so that people know that is a desire. And then they can know that while it may be a desire, it's not something we force on people, and it's not something we're insensitive about or anything like that, and proselytizing and trying to grab people. Of course, that's not what we're about, but that is an aspect of the Christian faith that we should acknowledge and be clear about on what we would see as Christianity. And then what is the purpose of a church? Well, generally, each church exists to represent the values and the beliefs and the teachings of Jesus Christ. And to the non-Christian community, the world around it, and then carrying that out of encouraging members and then seeking to draw people to this faith of Christianity. It's contextualized. Every neighborhood and every city, every country, they have their own kind of culture. And there's a way that Christianity is best communicated and expressed within that culture. And then the members of a church. Well, we would say the members of a church are what we call its congregation, and they share a common set of beliefs within the larger framework of Christianity that allows for minor variants and traditions. So generally, it's like with any group you would find, there's requirements of being in that group. If you're going to join your local parent-teacher association because your child's a member of that school, that's the point. You're joining because you are a parent of a child in the school. Or if you're going to join a bowling league, there are requirements. You show up to bowl, and it's just a basic understanding. If you're going to become a member of a college or a school, there are requirements, everything from tuition to acceptance of the school and to showing up for class or logging on for class or whatever. And if you're going to be a member of a baseball team, There are requirements. You play by the rules and you show up to play when everybody's playing. So the church has its own requirements, you could say, or marks of membership. And it's that set of common beliefs about Jesus Christ and about Christianity regarding that. Some very basic doctrines, we would say, on what that all means. So that's what a church is and what it does, and who the members of a church are and the leaders of a church. In the same way, football teams have a coach and classrooms have a teacher and cities have a mayor and all of that. Well, a church as an organization has leaders in it. These are men and women who, as the way it should be, they provide guidance and structure and facilitation of the activities of the church, but also they're there because of an inner desire that they have to provide leadership and structure to the church. They're also there because the congregation itself wants them to lead the church. And we'll see that that doesn't always play in the part as it should. But and then they're also there because of what we would say in the Christian faith is a call or a sense of God's involvement that has brought this person to a point of wanting to be a leader, but also being appropriate and prepared in competency to be a leader. I mean, there's a lot of people that want to be leaders of all kinds of things, but it's not appropriate for them because they either lack the competency or the character qualifications, so they shouldn't be. And the problem is in abusive churches, the wrong people are leading the church and they do not have the right character qualities. So in my studies and thinking about it, I've been out of my abusive church for about 20, wow, I've been out for a long time, about 25 years now. In my studies and thinking, I have isolated a number of attributes of an abusive, spiritually abusive church that I'd like to share with you. And I've put it in the terms of the 7 sins of spiritually abusive churches. And an abusive church might have all 7 of these. It might have only a few of them. And it might have some of them that are there more than others, the severity and the degree of these 7 sins. And also the church kind of can be abusive on a spectrum to where it's mildly abusive. You might even struggle with calling it an abusive church. You might just say, you know, it's really unhealthy, mistreats people, all the way to that church was a cult and it mistreated people. It ruined their lives. And I guess I wouldn't say my former abusive church ruined my life, but I can just say that it did so much toxic damage in my life and in the lives of others who were members of the church that I would put it at the far end of that spectrum. So, okay. The first thing that I would suggest to you is a sin of abusive churches is there is a control of information and environment that takes place within the abusive church. It's a matter of the package or the message, the information that is given out to you as a prospective member about the church, but also the information that is treated as truth within the church. Robert Lifton, in his book that he dealt with and introduced the concept of thought reform in the early 1960s, late 50s, he called this the control of the milieu. It is the tight control of information that flows around in a church. And the way this can happen in an abusive church is simply misleading and deceiving members and prospective members about the goals of the church, about the behavior of the church leaders, about the money of the church, and even about what the church intends to do for your life. A lot of promises are made that are simply not kept in the abusive church. So information and the environment itself are tightly controlled. It can also be controlled by things like the only kinds of Bible teachers that the members are encouraged to listen to, perhaps large media figure preachers, but only certain ones are okay, or only certain theologians in the last 2,000 years of the church are viewed as being acceptable and perhaps doctrinally correct, and the other ones are discouraged. And that kind of information control has a way of keeping members from really thinking and exercising their own conscience and their own studying and creative thinking about it. So the first thing I see in the sins of an abusive church is a tight control of information. It's just hard to figure out what they're about. In the very beginning stages of recruitment to this church, those who are in the beginning stages are only told select information about the history of the church, its failures, its internal disagreements, the church splits it's been through, the things that this church has gone through, and perhaps what problems it's had, perhaps even legally, or what moral problems the church has had, perhaps in its leaders, and also how they resolved those. That's the control of information. Another way that it's very common to see information controlled is by discouraging prospective members and new members, to discouraging them from talking to people who have left the church. And the preferred beliefs and theories that the church, the abusive church holds, they are presented to prospective members as if they're the only way a church can believe. So maybe it's something like the way this church does communion. There's only one way, and we'll show you in the Bible why it's the only way. Or perhaps it's the kinds of leaders we have in this church. It's only men, and it's only called an elder team, and we're going to show you in the Bible where this is the only real way to do it if you want to be the most Christian or biblical. And these are methods of causing members to begin to only seek truth and find truth that is from their church system, or that agrees with the system of their church. And oftentimes in these kinds of abusive churches, formal theological institutions and seminaries are criticized, and members are encouraged to limit their to limit their enrollment to only select schools and approved teachers and approved study courses. In fact, a lot of abusive churches that I've had to deal with, and even the one I was in, made fun of seminaries. They would routinely say seminaries ruin a person's usability for God, and they would call them cemeteries, and talk of the meaningless classes offered, and how ineffective they are, and how the church at large is so ineffective because the seminaries training pastors are just jokes. And yeah. Another way that they might do this is through controlling the education within the church, and particularly with children, having a lot of control over the training of children in the home, and even routinely controlling the children's education by keeping them out of public schools and away from public schools, or maintaining a very suspicious and isolated relationship from public schools and their non-Christian friends and whatnot. So it really starts out with information being tightly controlled. What you think and how you think is very important to the leaders of churches that abuse people. The second sin that I see is there is often an excessive demand for the members' resources. And the way I like to put it is this: the resources of the member in an abusive church flow from the member to the church. And by that, I mean to the leaders of the church. And it's the kind of situation where, belonging to a church like this, you are presented with a number of demands for your time. That's, I guess, the first thing, and your money, And it can get a lot darker and evil as it continues from there. But generally, there are excessive demands for financial, they might be called gifts or tithes, and they're demands. Now, in any good organization that a person belongs to, they're generally wanting to support that organization anyway. I mean, if I'm a part of a book club and we're meeting for coffee to discuss a book, I'm excited about the organization, and I'm going to spring for somebody's coffee along the way, and I'm going to be happy to do it. In fact, if the club's meeting at my house, I'm going to put on a spread or put on some desserts and gladly share that because I support the book club. But if the book club came to me and said, hey, Ken, being a part of this book club needs to cost you something. So we'll need you to buy all of us books for this book that you want to read. Not quite right. Abusive churches lay excessive demands for the members' resources, but they don't give very much back. They want your time. They want you there Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Wednesday evening, Monday morning prayer meeting, Thursday Bible study, perhaps Saturday evangelism training. I'm talking about my abusive church here. And that's not to mention throughout the week, more informal, unplanned meetings with mentors and mentees and all that. But basically, there's an excessive demand for your time. This is particularly hard on marriages, especially young couples who are raising children, because, man, today both couples usually are working. Saturdays and Sundays are, oh boy, the time of the week where you get to sleep in, and then when you spend time with each other and supporting each other in your relationship, training your children, and basically building a home and a family. Well, if your church is always poking in on your time, that's a way that a church can abuse you. It may ask for more and more money, as I've mentioned before. It may deny you resources through taking so much of your time that you don't take job promotions that would give you more resources. Or it may want you to contribute material resources to the church. Or perhaps if you're a carpenter or an electrician or a computer programmer or a photographer or a musician and have any of these skills, which most of us have some kind of a skill that we can do or that we do, the church very often will presume on you to donate those skills to the church, not only free of cost, but also with a little bit of pressure, a little bit of guilt, or maybe a lot on top of that. And then in its darker forms, your resources as a member could even include things like your relationships with your friends, your children, your marriage, and it can include go to the darker form of demanding money, kind of in a way that shakes you down for it, and even exploits people sexually and basically the way I like to look at it is these abusive churches extract the resources of their members. And I want to shy away from just saying, it ends in a sexual exploitation or something, because often, perhaps most of the time, it doesn't. It's just a matter of the church extracting things from its members, its leaders using its members to extract things of value without giving anything back, maybe arguing for all you're getting back, but not truly giving anything back. Well, the next sin of an abusive church that I come to and have come to is this: it's isolation. An abusive church increasingly draws members into itself and away from non-members and other relationships. The exception to this, and there is an exception, is that if any relationship carries the possibility, let me get that so you can see it, the possibility of recruitment, that relationship's allowed. So if the abusive church could make you what some people call deployable. In other words, you as a member of an abusive church, an unhealthy church, can join a bowling league with the hope and the expectation that 3 or 4 fellow bowlers are going to hear what you have to say and join your church. You see how this is a perversion of a healthy kind of sharing something that's good for you, and maybe a person wants it too, and it becomes twisted into where you are a recruiter. And if that's possible, the abusive church will often be fine with you continuing with outside relationships. But other than that, the abusive church becomes isolating. It does not want its members to have other friends outside the church. It'll even move to the point of not wanting members to enjoy the kinds of relationships with family, with parents and siblings and best friends that the member had before the abusive church. And this is very common in churches that abuse people, is that the new members lose their pre-abusive church friendships within months of joining the church. I grew up in a very close family. My grandparents were just, in one case, blocks away from my home where I grew up, and I grew up in the neighborhood where my parents were born, or where my mom was born, and where my dad grew up. And I had a lot of friends, and I went to the same schools that my parents went to. So our family had a lot of roots in this neighborhood, and I had dear friends from school, from the military, and just my whole life. And within a few short months of joining the church, I had followed the church's desires in isolating myself from my friends. And it wasn't until really years later that I left the church that I was able, through their mercy and grace, to reestablish some of those friendships. I also ended up kind of bagging out on a lot of family activities, holidays that we used to spend together, trips to the beach as a family with parents and siblings and cousins and all that. I really dropped all that as the church increasingly took over a lot of my life and my time, and also left me emotionally very exhausted, and to where I would not do things with people that loved me that weren't a member of my church. Well, this is part of the power of a church, of an abusive church, to try to isolate its members from that outside world, which can ask uncomfortable questions, which can influence members to maybe check out other churches, and all kinds of things that the abusive leaders don't want. So they tend to build churches that isolate from other friends and people and co-workers and whatnot. I also see that abusive churches view themselves as elite and of a higher quality in comparison to other churches. They foster elitism that is, well, it's a form of pride and through camaraderie. And you'll find this oftentimes, and I routinely find it through the abusive churches, arguing that while they see there are other churches in the community that believe the same things and are trying as hard as they could, none of them are really as good as this church. There's no preachers as good as this preacher. And the preacher could be a great preacher. He could be a famous preacher, but your abusive church preacher will remind you that the personal connection between him and the church make his preaching so much more powerful. And the other churches, the other Christians, well, they are viewed as backslidden, kind of milquetoasty, compromised, easy believism. They believe anything. They believe in a gospel that's easy to go to heaven and requires no suffering or pain or commitment. And so those churches are the reason why Christianity is not, as they would couch it in other words, but is taking things over. And they're the reason. But our church is better, and we are training you to be a better Christian. Our church would routinely refer to itself as a place where we are training Green Beret Christians. you need to roll your eyes back around to the front, because you probably rolled your eyes when you heard me say that. But we viewed ourselves as training a kind of Christian that could be sent anywhere in the world. And when you came back a year later, there'd be a church because of the elite training and nature of that sending church of our abusive church. Actually, if you came back a year later, I don't think you'd find a church. I think you'd probably find a very demoralized, burned out, and in some form addicted, miserable former church member. Just my opinion on that. But we were elite. We thought we were better. We thought we were the busiest Christians, the best Christians. We studied the most, memorized the most verses, and it all ended up with us looking out around us at other believers, other Christians in the world, and feeling better. Now, we needed to be humble, so we weren't gonna say we're great, but man, did we sure have a good view on why those other churches weren't so good. Well, the next sin that I see here of abusive churches is this: members of abusive churches fear displeasing the church leaders. Now, I don't know the particular kind of church that you might be thinking of in terms of being abusive. And quite honestly, I don't know where you might fall with this, but my gut feeling is it really does all end with the senior pastor. The senior pastor of a church sets the emotional tone of the church, presents the agenda to the church, and has somewhat of a captive audience in that a senior pastor, and that's the person who does the preaching, he has everyone's pretty much undivided attention, or other than doing shopping lists in the pew, which they don't allow in abusive churches. But he has that pulpit every single week to say what he wants to say and to reinforce his agenda, to reinforce his beliefs, and most importantly, to explain to the congregation why the Bible, which as a Christian, you hold that as the Word of God, why that Word is best explained by him and is best understood by him, and you should view it the same way as he does. And what all of this does is creates a sense where the church member hates to displease the pastor. And I've said church leaders because there's different people in that role, but it's usually the pastor. The desire to please the pastor is steadily replaced by the fear of displeasing the pastor or the leaders of an abusive church. You see that transition? The desire to have a healthy relationship with the pastor is replaced by a desire to just please the pastor so that the pastor likes you and likes what you're doing. And then that, as if that isn't bad enough, that gets replaced by the fear of displeasing the pastor. Often there's a complex system of rewards and punishments and consequences in abusive churches that facilitates this fear of displeasing the pastor. And most of the time, that is an emotional withdrawal of the pastor, if your church is small enough to where you know him and relate to him, or withdrawal of others from you who you've come to love and share your life with. And I've found that pastors that abuse very often devise their own concocted system of rewards and punishments for those members of the church who do not perform and do the way they want them to, or perhaps violate the desires of the pastor. It might be how the church member relates to social media. You might have a pastor that's out there looking at everybody's Facebook pages, stalking them. That happens a lot. It might be what the member likes to do for hobbies or go on vacations or whatever. The opinion of the pastor over what you do in your life becomes so important to you that you begin fearing displeasing the pastor. And that is a part of abusive churches that I've found to be consistent. in abusive churches, the pastor has power. And I'm not talking every pastor in every church, of course not. But in an abusive, sick church, the pastor has power to influence a member's reputation, sense of being welcomed and comfortable in the church, and even a member's assurance of her own salvation through teaching that your salvation, it may come freely through faith in Jesus Christ. That's what I believe. Abusive churches and their pastors never stop there. They always add into it something like, okay, your salvation is assured by Jesus Christ and his death and resurrection. That has assured salvation. But the way you can know you have that salvation is through a life of continued obedience. And that obedience, coincidentally, will be you being obedient to the structures, traditions, and rules that I, as your pastor, have determined are the way this church operates. And as you do these things, I will freely dispense to you my assurance of your salvation, and you can feel assured of it. You see what just happened? Something that Christianity believes historically is a free, unmerited, astounding, wonderful gift of God, simply through faith in this person, Jesus, has become something that costs you something, cost to be determined by the abusive leader. Man, that's a major part of my theology. I think about 20 years of work and thinking through it to get me out of that mindset. Well, I see the sixth sin of an abusive church is that there is a pressure, often a pressure to confess sin and moral failures. Now, what do I mean by that? Abusive churches expect their members to open up their lives, whether they like it or not, their deepest thoughts, feelings, ethical and moral failures, and sins, and all of that. The abusive church always is moving toward its members experiencing a kind of a violation of always having to peel kind of like the layers of an onion, to always confess your deep, abiding, constant need for the church. Now, you know you need the Lord. If you're a Christian, that's what you believe. But the church substitutes, the abusive church substitutes itself in a way that you need. Yes, you need the Lord, and the way you need the Lord and the way it works is you need the abusive church. You need that pastor. You need to be in good standing there, and you confess your sins, and that's how you achieve that. By openly admitting your flaws, things you've done wrong, things you did wrong before you joined, and all of that. And then receiving, you may be forgiven by God, but the abusive church and the narcissistic abusive pastor will see fit for him to incarnate that forgiveness by dispensing it to you from himself. And abusive churches often force members to talk more deeply about their personal lives than they're comfortable doing. Husbands talking about things between them and their wives that have no place being discussed outside of the marriage, but under the guise of marriage help, you share things about your dear wife that nobody should be hearing. And wives talking about their husbands and his problems and his hangups in ways that nobody should be hearing, but the abusive church pressures for you to open everything up to where there are simply no more healthy secrets. And the church does that. It never really gets to the bottom of it, so the work goes on to pressure its members into doing that, and it makes life pretty miserable. The seventh thing that I find in these abusive churches is a rejection of members who leave the church. So if a member leaves or even talks about leaving, or lets anybody know he or she is thinking of leaving, the punishments begin immediately before the person even leaves. When I left my church, I said I wanted to leave, said I was thinking of leaving, said within the next 6 months or so I'm going to leave. I mean, I really hemmed and hawed my way around because I was so scared of everybody. But man, the withdrawal, the isolation, the rumors, the loss of all ministry positions and all of that, it started immediately. Abusive churches reject members who leave the church or even talk about it. You will become, what do I say, a persona non grata. And the ways this happens, that there's that they're rejected, it takes place before a person leaves and after a person leaves. Before they leave, they're rejected by letting them know they're going to be rejected if they leave. And then it's modeled to the congregation of the church that those who do leave the church are liable to be slandered, talked about, and just mistreated generally for having left the church. And then the other way that it takes place is after the person leaves the church. He's cut off from all of his relationships, his friendships, and all of that. He loses it all because he left the unhealthy, abusive church. When a person leaves the church, they should leave the church with full communication and honesty of kind of like, hey, have we done anything to make you leave, or how are we with each other? And assuming things are all fine and dandy, then it should be, well, you know what? God bless you for listening to his voice, for following your heart, your conscience. And you may not be a member of this particular church anymore, but you're always going to be a member of the people that we love. You let us know any way we can help you as life goes on. So those are the key sins that I see. There are some others I could throw in there now, but those are the key things I see. And it ends with that rejection of those who leave the church. And I think the way I've termed it in my book is a painful exit. They're painful to leave, and they're painful to even contemplate leaving. That's a sign of an abusive church. It shouldn't hurt to be in a church. It shouldn't hurt to leave a church. And then I wrote about these things in much more detail in my book, In the House of Friends, Understanding and Healing from Spiritual Abuse in Christian Churches. And so, yeah, that's that. So church isn't supposed to hurt. What do we do when it does hurt? Just briefly. Well, we identify where the hurt comes from. We identify where the hurt comes from by educating ourselves about spiritual abuse, about what the true standards of Christianity are. And I'm convinced we do it by contemplating leaving the abusive church. I have personally never known anybody over the last 25 years who has stayed and had the power to turn their churches around. Most abusive pastors do not have the desire to stop abusing and cut off the flow of resources that come to them and the power and all of that. So I feel the best step when your church is truly an abusive church is to walk out the door. You can communicate with the church in whatever way you're comfortable communicating, but you know something, if your conscience tells you they're not going to listen and they don't care, you can just let them know, hey, I won't be here anymore, and walk out the door. And certainly do not continue giving them anything. Don't contribute any more. They've already gotten enough. I look forward to hearing your comments and your questions about this, as we'll do now in the next few minutes. And I thank you so much for joining this meetup.